Good evening. As twilight settles in, let us ease into tonight's reflections with curiosity and calm. Our journey together will explore themes of immigration enforcement, community response, legal boundaries, and the whispers of tomorrow, all delivered in a gentle rhythm designed to soothe the mind before rest. We begin with a matter close to the land and its laborers, unfolding into wider currents of governance, compassion, and civic trust. Tonight's layered exploration invites you to linger on each nuance, to breathe deeply, and to trust in understanding. We will unfold 5 interconnected reflections from the fields where workers toil to courtrooms and city squares, to imagined futures guiding our collective spirit. This evening's narrative, though rooted in serious events, is delivered without alarm, softly urging reflection, not fear. And as we weave in familiar threads from our opening, you'll find reassurance that even amid tension, nuanced clarity can bring calm and perspective. Earlier, we opened tonight's reflection with the gentle notion that beneath even the most turbulent stories lies something more than policy or partisanship. There are people, patterns, and possibilities. Now we deepen our gaze into one such unfolding event. Former President Donald Trump's renewed call for sweeping immigration raids, including the use of Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) to deport what he describes as millions of undocumented individuals. This isn't the first time such a statement has rippled across national discourse, but the timing, tone, and political context suggest a deliberate effort to recast immigration as the centerpiece of his 2024 campaign. The comments shared on Truth Social were blunt and striking. The largest domestic deportation operation in American history, Trump promised. And though such declarations are often framed within campaign rhetoric, they resonate deeply with a range of audiences, from political supporters who view immigration enforcement as a pillar of law and order to immigrant families for whom each such announcement is not abstract but deeply personal. And in between are other employers, farmers, local officials whose daily realities are tethered to the very workforce Trump proposes to remove. Among the most vocal opponents to these renewed promises are those in the agricultural sector. Across states like California, Georgia, and Iowa, growers have issued quiet but urgent reminders undocumented workers make up an estimated 50% or more of the agricultural labor force. Their presence is not simply tolerated, it is in many ways foundational to the American food system. Removing such a large portion of that workforce, they argue, would risk devastating ripple effects from supply chain instability to inflationary pressures on food prices. It's a message not of ideology, but of logistics. And yet the conversation is not binary. There are valid concerns across many communities about border control, fair employment, and public safety. Immigration systems are complex, and decades of gridlock have left gaps, loopholes, and a growing sense of disorder. Trump's critics often point to the dehumanizing language and sweeping generalizations embedded in his rhetoric. His supporters argue that laws must be enforced, that sovereignty must mean something, and that controlled borders are not inherently unjust. Between these poles lies a quieter truth. No nation can avoid the need to manage who enters and stays within its borders. But how that is done, whether with dignity or through fear, whether through bipartisan reform or unilateral declarations determines far more than legality. It shapes identity cohesion and international reputation. As this section draws to a close, let us return briefly to the image from earlier labourers in fields quietly working, uncertain of tomorrow. Their hands, so often invisible, shape our daily bread. In their story, we find not just policy, but humanity. As we prepare to go deeper, we carry with us this dual awareness that the broad brush of national security always traces over lives, names, and everyday moments. From the edges of campaign promises to the heart of real-world implications, we now take a deeper breath and step further inward. This evening we turn our focus to how and why these proposals stir not just headlines, but enduring questions about systems, about memory, and about the invisible hands that hold up entire sectors of our society. To understand the renewed emphasis on deportations, one must look back to 2017-2019, when then-President Trump authorized ICE to conduct high-profile workplace raids. One such event in Mississippi targeted poultry plants, resulting in nearly 700 arrests, the largest single-state immigration enforcement action in U.S. history. What followed were not just viral images of crying children or community vigils, but labor shortages that forced employers to cut shifts and truck food in from other states. The enforcement was meant to be a deterrent. It also unavoidably became a case study in unintended consequences. These precedents echo today as farmers and food processors, many of them in conservative regions, express quiet dismay at proposals that could again destabilize the agricultural labor force. In recent interviews, several growers voiced the same concern. Who will pick the crops? These are not rhetorical flourishes. According to data from the USDA and Farm Bureau organizations, more than 2.4 million hired crop workers sustain the U.S. food system, and as many as half are undocumented. These workers are not merely present, they are essential. And yet, the debate is not limited to the fields. In cities and suburbs, the call for ICE raids sparks fear and uncertainty within mixed-status families, many of whom have lived in the US for decades, raised American-born children, and contribute to local economies. These individuals often straddle two worlds, deeply embedded in the social fabric, yet legally vulnerable. For them, each new announcement from Trump's platform is not campaign rhetoric. It is a potential rupture. But let us pause here. While political language can often inflame, real-world enforcement is shaped by legal frameworks, budget constraints, and logistical realities. The Department of Homeland Security has finite resources. Even during Trump's presidency, ICE faced internal limitations, courts backlogged with hundreds of thousands of cases, sanctuary policies in many cities, and legal protections for specific categories of immigrants. A promise to remove millions is not simply a matter of intention. It would require immense legal coordination, cooperation from states, and extraordinary funding, none of which are guaranteed. At the same time, these calls reignite another kind of conversation about reform. For years, bipartisan attempts to pass immigration legislation addressing border security dreamers and pathways to citizenship have failed, stymied by political gridlock and election year posturing. As a result, the system remains patchworked and reactive, unable to meet the moral and economic demands of the moment. That patchwork reality gives rise to tension. To some Americans, it feels like open borders. To others, it feels like a humanitarian failure. And to many, it simply feels unsustainable. It is here in the middle of this complexity that we seek not easy answers but deeper understanding. We must also acknowledge how language shapes outcomes. When the former president refers to immigrants as invaders or warns of bloodshed, it not only influences policy, it influences public perception. Fear becomes a lens, distorting the distinctions between those seeking asylum, those working quietly, and those who may pose legitimate risks. It is a flattening of the human experience into a single caricature. But immigration, like democracy itself, is textured. It is composed of arrivals and stories of aspiration and adaptation. There are those advocates, faith leaders, even former immigration judges, who argue for a more measured tone. They urge due process, smarter technology at the border, and above all, respect. They argue that a secure border need not be cruel, that legality and dignity are not mutually exclusive. Their vision, though quieter, persists. Returning now to the farmers, we remember their unusual position in this debate. They may share Trump's broader values, but many reject this specific policy. We need reform, not raids, one Wisconsin grower told NPR. Don't punish the people who make breakfast possible. So, as we near the end of this reflection, we carry with us both gravity and grace. Yes, immigration is a national issue, but it is also personal, deeply rooted in the hands and hearts of those who live in its shadow. Policies may begin in speeches, but they unfold in kitchens, in schools, in the early morning fields of a California valley, or the dusty edge of a Texas orchard. Let us hold space for all of it, the law, the labor, the lives behind the labels. Now let us pause at the quiet edge of possibility. We are not here to predict nor to provoke anxiety, but to gently imagine. In this space, shaped by twilight and thoughtfulness, we explore the what-ifs that linger just outside the realm of news, not as warnings, but as invitations to think more deeply about cause and consequence, and how decisions made in policy chambers ripple outward through everyday lives. What if, for example, Donald Trump's plan for mass deportations were not only enacted, but scaled quickly? What might happen to the agricultural landscape? Based on historical patterns, many farms would face immediate labor shortages. Some might automate further, others might abandon entire harvests. And yet others, perhaps unable to recover, could close altogether. Food prices, already vulnerable to climate change and global supply chain disruptions, might rise. The burden would be most acutely felt by families with modest incomes, those for whom fresh produce and dairy are already an economic stretch. But what if the policy met resistance at the state level? As happened during the Trump administration, Several states and cities could reassert sanctuary policies, limiting local cooperation with federal raids. Legal battles would likely follow, tying up implementation in courts while communities endure prolonged uncertainty. In such a scenario, neither the federal government nor the local jurisdictions emerge unscathed. Public trust in governance erodes on all sides. And what if instead of mass enforcement, the energy were directed toward reform? What if lawmakers, perhaps spurred by the disruption caused by renewed raids, return to the negotiating table? A compromise could include tighter border security, but also stable legal pathways for long-term undocumented residents and protections for essential workers. In this case, families could emerge from the shadows, employers could hire without fear, and immigration officers could focus resources on legitimate threats. We can also imagine human-centered responses. Suppose churches, synagogues, and community centers revived the sanctuary movement of previous decades. History teaches us that where policy turns rigid, human empathy often finds ways to soften its sharpness. Networks of solidarity might form again, quiet, legal, peaceful. Students might write letters to Congress. Employers might appear in court on behalf of detained workers. In this light, even contentious decisions can stir new civic engagement. Now, imagine a child born in the United States to undocumented parents. She attends school, speaks English, recites the Pledge of Allegiance. What if her father is deported under a broad sweep, not for a crime, but simply for lacking papers? What lessons does she absorb, not just about government, but about belonging? If children become collateral in policy wars, the long-term cost is not only social, it is moral. And yet, even in these imagined outcomes, we are not lost. For each hypothetical problem, there exists a pathway to thoughtfulness. This is why we imagine not to despair, but to explore with clarity what might otherwise pass unnoticed. Let us carry these quiet scenarios with us, not as prophecies, but as questions gently held in the mind. And so we come to the final stretch of our evening journey, a place, not of endings, but of gentle transformation. Tonight we have wandered through complex terrain, political promises and personal lives, legal frameworks and fragile crops, fear and resilience. We have examined not only what has been said, but what it might mean and what it might feel like when filtered through the hands of those who quietly sustain a nation's food, care for its children, and build its homes. In all these moments, there is one common thread: interdependence. The rhetoric of division may dominate the airwaves, but the rhythms of life, of planting, cleaning, building, healing, continue through cooperation. The truth is, no matter the policy, we are already interconnected. Our meals are made by hands of many origins. Our hospitals run on the work of immigrants and citizens alike. Our neighborhoods pulse with languages, accents, and traditions that braid into a deeper American story. When we reflect upon Trump's proposals, not as an isolated event, but as part of a longer arc of immigration debates, of enforcement policy, of campaign theater, we find that there is space for all responses: concern, support, confusion, and hope. But to respond wisely, we must ask more than, what will happen? We must also ask, what can we learn? One lesson is that law and humanity must not part ways. that every enforcement tool, every policy debate should hold space for dignity. Another lesson is the enduring power of voice, not just from leaders, but from local communities, from employers, from children growing up bilingual and bicultural, from everyday people navigating extraordinary systems. There will always be those who campaign in absolutes, who promise action without nuance. But each evening, when the cameras dim and the streets fall quiet, what remains are families gathered at dinner tables, workers rising early to care for the land, and teachers preparing for another day in classrooms filled with many flags and one pledge. Tonight, as you settle into rest, consider this. We are all shaped by the stories we hear and the stories we tell. And in the space between the two, there is room for empathy to grow, not as sentiment, but as insight. Let tomorrow's conversations be guided not only by ideology, but by imagination, not only by fear, but by faith in process, in people, in progress. May you rest well with the knowledge that thoughtfulness still matters, and that the quiet act of listening may be among the most radical forms of participation. Good night, and may tomorrow greet you gently with renewed clarity and a deeper sense of connection. Good evening, and thank you for welcoming this quiet moment of reflection before the day folds itself into memory. In the stillness of the night, when the noise of headlines fades, we find room not just to listen, but to wonder softly, slowly, without judgment. Tonight we trace a theme that has quietly shaped much of recent civic life in America, the role of organized activism, and the delicate line between spontaneity and strategy in public protest. This conversation comes into focus following recent commentary by journalist Asra Nomani, who explored the coordinated engine behind anti-Trump demonstrations, suggesting a vast network of non-profits and political groups working in unison, rather than a spontaneous outpouring of public sentiment. But before we dive into names and numbers, let us pause for a moment and acknowledge a gentle truth. Democracy, by its nature, is a chorus of voices. Some louder, some better funded, some carefully choreographed, and others no less powerful for being raw, unscripted, or quietly determined. In the article that sparked tonight's reflection, Nomani paints a picture not of chaos, but of orchestration. She sees behind the protest banners a $2.1 billion machine composed of hundreds of organizations shaping not only events, but narratives. This idea may sound sharp at first, but as with most things, there is more nuance in the shadows than there is in the spotlight. And so we will move carefully, slowly, and with respect for all the forces at play. There is comfort in understanding, not in taking sides, but in seeing the paths others walk and asking calmly, why here? Why now? Who are the real actors behind this public theatre of dissent and resistance? And what does it mean for a democracy that often prides itself on the individual voice? We begin then not with judgment, but with curiosity. What fuels protest in the modern age? How do organized networks balance empowerment and control? And how do we, the quiet observers and the thoughtful sleepers, hold space for both skepticism and sympathy? Over the next few chapters, well explore the claims of professionalized activism, delving gently into the data, lifting up multiple perspectives, and considering the possible futures such dynamics might shape. Well, also entertain questions that begin with what if, not to speculate wildly, but to reflect peacefully on the directions we might yet go. So settle in. Pour a warm drink if you like. You won't be startled here. Only invited gently to think a little longer than the headlines would allow. As we transition now into a deeper exploration of what Nomani calls the machine behind the movement, let's carry this calm with us. For behind every protest sign, every chant and every tweet, there are humans, some tired, some hopeful, some skeptical, trying in their own way to shape tomorrow. And so we continue gently into the fabric of the modern protest movement, not with accusation, but with attention. In Asra Nomani's analysis, what may have looked like spontaneous civil resistance in recent months, marches and messaging aligned under banners like #No Kings, was in fact the result of strategic planning by an extensive network of progressive institutions. It's a claim that resonates with many who view American politics through a lens of increasing polarization, and it brings forward essential questions. Can something orchestrated still be authentic? And does funding necessarily distort a cause? Nomani's report identifies hundreds of non-profit organizations, political action committees and advocacy groups that she argues are actively coordinating anti-Trump demonstrations. Their combined revenue, an estimated $2.1 billion annually. Some familiar names include the American Federation of Teachers, the ACLU, the Sierra Club, Indivisible, and MoveOn.org. Others are more specialized, regional, or relatively unknown, but part of the wider web. Rather than being ad hoc, many of the protests she discusses were supported by centralized toolkits, digital documents offering branded visuals, protest slogans, printable signs, and instructions on event planning. One such rallying cry was "No Kings in America," a phrase that channels both theatricality and historical resonance. Toolkits also recommended colors, hashtags and phrases meant to maintain visual and rhetorical unity across states and cities. There's a kind of marketing polish to it, a sophistication in packaging the message that to some may feel at odds with the rawness we traditionally associate with grassroots activism. But what does this really mean? There's no denying that organizing at scale requires resources. Coordinated signage helps unify a message. Social media templates allow rapid sharing across timelines. And in the digital age, virality often depends less on passion and more on presentation. What Nomani highlights, then, is not new, but newly visible to some. And visibility can make people uncomfortable, especially when it contradicts the image of a ground-up, people-powered surge. Still, there's another way to look at it. Organizations like those listed above have long existed as scaffolding for political engagement. Their infrastructure, fundraising arms, communications departments, trained volunteers can amplify causes already simmering in the public's mind. They don't necessarily create the sentiment, but they help shape it, and perhaps more importantly, help deliver it to policymakers, media, and the broader public. We might think of it like this. The fire is already burning. These organizations bring kindling air and direction, but they don't always strike the match. Citizens still show up because something in their lives moved them. Something personal, even if it aligns with a collective script. Critics of this model argue that it professionalizes dissent to the point where the line between citizen and agent blurs. If a teacher shows up at a rally funded in part by their union, is that free expression or institutional participation? It can be both. Reality, as always, resists binaries. The article further points to high executive salaries at these non-profits, some exceeding hundreds of thousands of dollars, as evidence that these aren't modest mom-and-pop advocacy groups. It's true in the ecosystem of political organizing, influence often travels alongside capital. But again, one could argue that scale demands competence, and competence in many professional environments is compensated accordingly. Let us pause here. What we're seeing is a system that mirrors many others in modern life, a blend of passion and process emotion and enterprise. Protest in this sense becomes a form of communication, yes, with moral weight, but also with strategic rhythm. It is loud and poetic, but also timed and choreographed. We may feel unsettled by that, or we may feel reassured knowing that advocacy is not left to chance. Either way, recognizing the machinery doesn't erase the message. It simply reminds us that public will, like any signal, needs amplification. And if we listen not just to the chant, but to the silence behind it, if we ask why so many people, aided or not, are moved to take to the streets, we begin to see not a conspiracy, but a story of power and of participation. Now let's continue our quiet journey by asking a deeper question. What are the emotional, civic, and cultural stakes of this machine-made mobilization? And what can it teach us about both the nation and ourselves? As we allow our thoughts to settle deeper into this evening's reflection, we arrive at the gentle core of the question. What is the meaning of protest when it is organized? What happens when the machinery of institutions enters the space where once only voices stood? To begin answering that, let us first return to the faces behind those movements. The individuals who attend protests, repost toolkits and hold signs, whether mass-produced or hand-painted rarely, if ever, passive participants in someone else's game. Even in movements supported by political infrastructure, participation still demands something precious: time, presence, belief. The real story, then, is not one of puppets and puppet masters, but of alignment. When organizations like Indivisible, Planned Parenthood Action Fund, or the ACLU craft messages, they do so in anticipation of public resonance. Their toolkits offer language for feelings that may already exist: fear, outrage, hope, disillusionment, and channel them toward shared, visible action. In this light, the $2.1 billion machine becomes less sinister and more systemic. It represents not manipulation, but mediation, a process by which large-scale grievances find form through institutional scaffolding. It is not perfect, but it is not automatically corrupt. Let's take the term astroturfing, which Asra Nomani invokes, meant to suggest artificial grassroots activity. The concern is valid when a movement is indistinguishable from a marketing campaign, when every protest looks alike, when hashtags trend too easily. Some may begin to question sincerity. Yet, as with many things in modern civic life, the situation isn't black and white. There is a long history of organized protest in America. The labor movement, the civil rights marches of the 1960s, the Tea Party and the Women's March all relied on networks' communications strategy and, yes, funding. Movements grow, and as they do, they seek structure. Sometimes that structure arrives through coalitions of non-profits and unions, sometimes through informal communities online. But the existence of a coordinated effort doesn't negate the authenticity of the cause. It simply reflects scale. And scale in a media-saturated world is necessary. A homemade sign in a crowd of 10 may carry deep emotion, but it's the thousands holding identical signs that catch the lens of a news camera. This is not vanity. It is visibility. In a competitive media environment, unity of image is sometimes the only way to make noise without shouting. That said, caution is appropriate. When protest becomes too coordinated, it can alienate. When language becomes too polished, it can lose its edge. The strength of civil resistance lies in its capacity to feel human, imperfect, emotional alive. If every slogan is pre-approved, every image designed, it risks becoming sterile. The challenge, then, for advocacy organizations is not to suppress spontaneity, but to leave room for it. Nomani's article also raises another sensitive but important point: money. Many Americans are uneasy with the influence of capital in civic life. Whether in campaigns, lobbying, or protest, the idea that money speaks louder than people is troubling. And yet, the question becomes, how do we support causes at scale without resources? How do we travel, print, rally, train, feed, secure, and broadcast a message without funding? It is a paradoxon that haunts movements on all sides of the political spectrum. Conservatives, too, have their networks, donors, and toolkits. Political activity in any form relies on organization. The critical lens must be applied equally. More than that, we must ask, what if these organizations are not just drivers of protest, but protectors of process? Consider the groups that provide legal observers at demonstrations, arrange bail funds, or negotiate with police to ensure safety. Their role is not always to agitate, but to safeguard civil liberties, to ensure the right to protest endures even when the message is unpopular. So what are we to do with this information? We hold it gently. We acknowledge the complexity. We recognize that modern protest is part emotion, part engineering, and we accept that neither part invalidates the other. There is value in seeing the machine, but there is also value in seeing the heart within it. Just as a symphony requires both the composer and the conductor, and the musician who plays from the soul movements needs structure and spirit coordination and courage. As we move now into a more imaginative space, let us not speculate wildly, but wonder softly. What if the system changed? What if movements were only ever grassroots or only ever institutional? Would they still move us? Or is their power rooted in this fragile, uneasy balance? Let us wander now into that space where the mind drifts before sleep, where possibility lives not as threat, but as gentle question. What if we ask not to stir alarm, but to let our thoughts stretch and breathe? What if in an alternate future, protests could occur without any formal structure, no toolkits, no non-profit sponsorships, no slogans crafted in conference rooms? Imagine a world where every demonstration was born purely of local feeling, without guidance or framing, without hashtags or logos. A town square gathering in one place, a candlelight vigil in another. Authentic, unfiltered, but perhaps also scattered, less visible, more easily ignored. Would the message carry as far without the reach of networks? Would safety be ensured without trained organizers? Would impact survive without shared visuals or slogans that echo across states? Then again, what if the opposite were true? What if every protest became a productfully designed, branded, strategized, and released like a campaign? What if no rally could begin without prior approval from a central office? If even the chants were chosen from a list tested for impact, pre-approved for tone? In such a world, protests might reach wider audiences, but would they still feel like dissent? Would they stir hearts, or simply signal affiliation? Could they still surprise us, move us, or would they fade into the background noise of curated political theatre? Now take it further. What if, rather than seeing these dynamics as opposites, we saw them as layers of the same truth? Imagine a world where professional coordination quietly supports organic feeling. A toolkit exists, but it's optional. A sign template circulates, but so do scribbled drawings on cardboard. Organizations offer resources, but don't dictate purpose. In such a world, protests would be both grounded and guided, spontaneous in spirit, yet safe in structure. Perhaps this is not a dream. Perhaps it is already here, unfolding in places where humanity and logistics hold each other in balance. Another scenario. What if transparency became the norm? Every flyer, every post, every hashtag would include a sponsored byline. Citizens would know not just what they're joining, but who's helping them do it. This might build trust, it might create hesitation. Either way, clarity could offer comfort. And finally, a thought both quiet and strange. What if we simply paused? If for 1 week all organizations stood back, all campaigns paused, all coordination ceased, would the people still march? Would the streets still fill? In that stillness we might find our answer, not in whether movements are organized, but in whether people still feel called. These are not warnings, they are questions. They are the soft shape of dreams, born not from fear, but from reflection. And as the stars blink above us, let us hold these what-ifs lightly, like leaves in a stream, drifting, turning, disappearing gently into the current of thought. In the next and final part of our reflection, we'll return to the present, but with softened eyes and slower breath. We'll ask what tomorrow might look like and what role calm understanding plays in shaping it. And so we arrive gently at the close of our evening path. We've wandered through the winding roads of coordination and protest, of structure and spontaneity, of funding and freedom. We've seen how organized efforts can both support and stir questions, how activism in modern times is neither entirely grassroots nor wholly mechanical, but something in between, delicate and evolving. Now, in the quiet hush that comes before sleep, we ask not for resolution, but for renewal. What does all this mean, not for headlines, but for the deeper rhythms of our civic life? Perhaps it means this, that our democracy is alive, not perfect, not still, but pulsing, with people who care enough to act, to gather, to speak, even when their voices blend with others. Whether guided by organizations or rising from within these efforts, show us that public will still matters. There is peace in knowing that so many seek to shape their world. That energy is not dangerous, it is essential. Our task, perhaps, is to remain both vigilant and generous, to examine the sources behind movements without dismissing their meaning, to hold institutions accountable, but also recognize their potential to elevate voices that might otherwise go unheard. And there is hope in the possibility of balance. The protester with a hand-painted sign, the young organizer sharing a toolkit, the teacher marching beside the student. These are not contradictions. They are the harmony of modern civic life, messy, complex, and profoundly human. The machinery Nomani describes may be large, but it is not impenetrable. It can be guided. It can evolve. And so can we. Each time we engage through protest, through listening, through small conversations in quiet rooms, we help shape not only what is seen, but what is possible. Tonight, as you rest, remember, democracy is not built in rallies alone. It lives in reflection. In our willingness to look deeper, feel more kindly, and ask harder questions with softer hearts, the signs may be printed, the funding may be vast, but still at the heart of every movement is a person who simply wishes for a better day. And that wish, like a candle in the dark, remains unbranded, unfunded, just human. So rest now. Tomorrow will come, and with it more chances to listen, to learn, to lift. You have done enough for today. Good night, and may understanding walk beside you always. Good evening and welcome to tonight's calm and reflective news moment. As we settle into the quiet of the evening, let's take a moment together to gently explore a story that speaks to both policy and purpose and gently invites us to consider its broader ripple effects. At first glance, it may appear to be another shift in immigration enforcement, but as we peel back the layers, we discover nuances that touch communities' governance and individual lives in unexpected ways. Today, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, has undertaken a series of interior enforcement operations across the United States. These operations have involved detentions that include people without criminal convictions. Understanding why this is happening sees us journeying through official motivations, political messaging, the human toll, and the many perspectives at play. We'll gently unpack each dimension piece by piece. This evening story invites reflection. What does crime-focused messaging really mean? And how does it translate into action? As we move forward, the intention is to share not only facts, but also context and care, so that as you drift towards sleep, your thoughts are full of informed awareness rather than tension. In the next few parts, we'll examine the numbers behind the operations and their implications. We'll hear from policymakers, look at data changes, and consider the voices urging change. Along the way, we'll reflect on what this tells us about national priorities and community resilience. And finally, we'll imagine possible futures and close with a hopeful message that tomorrow will bring new understanding and opportunity. Let this gentle hour be a space for thoughtful listening. With curiosity as our guide, let's begin. As we begin to explore this story more deeply, we find ourselves looking not only at headlines, but at the interplay of numbers, intent, and lived experience. According to the latest report from Reuters, U.S. immigration enforcement under Donald Trump's renewed campaign is witnessing a noticeable shift despite consistent messaging that prioritizes the arrest and deportation of individuals with criminal records. More than 40% of recent arrests by ICE have involved non-criminal migrants. The context is layered. Former President Trump, now campaigning for another term, has framed immigration enforcement as a matter of public safety and national security. In recent speeches and interviews, he has spoken of cleaning up our cities and removing dangerous elements. This rhetoric echoes themes from his previous term, during which ICE's focus was repeatedly defined as targeting those with convictions for serious crimes. Yet the Reuters analysis based on newly released federal data reveals a more complex reality. In the first 5 months of 2025, about 40% of ICE arrests involved individuals without any prior criminal convictions. This figure marks a significant increase from 28% in 2019, the last full year before President Biden took office. While enforcement priorities may appear unchanged in public statements, the field-level implementation suggests something else is happening. ICE officials have defended the arrests, noting that the agency has broad authority to detain anyone without lawful immigration status, regardless of criminal history. "We don't turn a blind eye to anyone," one official told Reuters. "Presence in the country unlawfully is still a civil offense that warrants removal." But immigration advocates, legal scholars, and some local officials argue that this broader sweep undercuts the administration's stated crime-focused goals. This tension between stated policy and on-the-ground action is not new in American governance, especially when it comes to immigration. Still, it becomes more pronounced during election seasons when policy decisions and political messaging often blur. To make sense of this, it's helpful to consider the motivations behind these shifts. For the Trump campaign, messaging on immigration remains a powerful tool. It appeals to a sense of law and order control and the promise of national renewal. Yet the practical side of enforcement reveals a far more nuanced and sometimes contradictory landscape. arresting individuals with no criminal record, many of whom have long-standing ties to their communities. Jobs and schools raises moral and logistical questions that extend beyond partisan frames. We must also consider the human geography behind these numbers. Many of those detained are long-time residents of the US, some with US citizen children. Others may have pending asylum claims or have fled regions of violence, instability, or climate collapse. Their quiet integration into American life working in agriculture, caregiving, or service industries often goes unseen, but their absence is deeply felt when enforcement actions occur. Moreover, ICE's actions do not unfold in a vacuum. They ripple outward through classrooms, workplaces, neighborhoods, and local governments. Some cities and counties have resisted cooperation with federal immigration detainers, citing concerns over public trust and local law enforcement capacity. Others have leaned into the operations, aligning themselves with federal priorities and embracing Trump's national narrative. Even within the Republican Party, views on immigration enforcement are not monolithic. Some support broader enforcement as a deterrent and a reflection of sovereign law, while others, particularly business leaders and agricultural coalitions, warn that sweeping detentions could hurt local economies and strain essential services. The numbers continue to shift, but the underlying story remains steady. Immigration enforcement, even when conducted under the banner of crime prevention, often sweeps up people whose only legal infraction is being here without documentation. And while that fact may satisfy statutory definitions, it remains ethically complex when viewed through the lens of family contribution and potential. In this moment, we return gently to the idea that policy, when implemented, is not a static script. It is a living practice interpreted by individuals, affected by local dynamics, and ultimately felt in human terms. We carry this thought forward into our deeper analysis. Why is this happening really? Who benefits and who bears the cost? Let us continue with a steady pace and a patient gaze toward greater understanding. Let us now move gently into the heart of the matter. Not just what is happening, but why it is happening and how it might be understood from different angles. The current increase in non-criminal ICE arrests, despite the administration's focus on violent offenders and public safety, invites a deeper reflection on how enforcement strategies are shaped by politics, bureaucracy, and the quiet complexities of governance. First, let us consider the institutional context. ICE, like many federal agencies, operates with both legal latitude and logistical limitations. While its official directives may prioritize those with criminal convictions, its officers are still authorized to arrest any undocumented immigrant. This discretion leaves room for variation across regions, and in many cases, field agents default to opportunity-based enforcement, acting when they encounter anyone without legal status, regardless of criminal background. One former ICE supervisor interviewed by Reuters noted that the crime focus is a guide, but not a rule. In practice, agents often arrest the individuals they can find, not necessarily the ones they were told to prioritize. This simple but critical point reveals the gap between campaign messaging and bureaucratic momentum. It also hints at the logistical constraints. ICE faces backlogs in processing, staffing limitations, and the unpredictability of field conditions. At the same time, political incentives play a quiet but powerful role. President Trump has long leaned on immigration rhetoric to mobilize his base. By presenting a picture of determined, wide-reaching enforcement, the campaign aligns with long-standing themes of control strength and national restoration. But this political performance does not always reflect the nuance of what actually unfolds on the ground. There is also a legal distinction worth examining: the difference between civil and criminal violations. Entering the US without inspection is a civil infraction. Re-entering after deportation can be a criminal offense, but neither status necessarily means that the individual poses a threat to public safety. Critics argue that framing non-criminal detentions as a public safety measure conflates legal categories in ways that may mislead the public and erode trust in enforcement institutions. This is why local and national advocacy groups continue to push for more precise and transparent data reporting. Without clarity, they argue policies become abstractions, ideas repeated in speeches but untethered from their consequences. And those consequences are deeply personal. For a farm worker detained during a routine traffic stop, for a mother picked up while dropping her child off at school, or for a young man with no record pulled aside at a bus station, the experience is one of fear, uncertainty, and sometimes irreversible separation. Still, there are voices offering more pragmatic defenses of the practice. Supporters of broader ICE operations argue that enforcement must remain flexible to be effective. If agents are too narrowly constrained, they risk missing opportunities to uphold immigration law, they say. Furthermore, in some cases, individuals without convictions may still have open charges, fraud findings, or multiple removals. These grey areas complicate any attempt to draw a sharp line between criminal and non-criminal. And what of the social impact? That too requires a balanced view. Research has shown that large-scale ICE arrests can have chilling effects on communities, especially when they appear indiscriminate. Some local police departments report lower cooperation from immigrant residents after high-profile raids, citing fears of deportation or misunderstanding. Schools and clinics may see decreased attendance in immigrant neighborhoods. The fabric of civic trust, already delicateous, tested each time federal action is seen as overly broad. But other communities report a different reaction. In some towns where enforcement has increased, local leaders say residents feel safer or more confident in the rule of law. This divergence in sentiment underscores that immigration is not merely a policy issue, it is a mirror through which we project values, fears, and competing definitions of community. Even among immigrants themselves, perspectives vary. Some undocumented individuals support strong enforcement for those with serious records, hoping it might ease scrutiny on those trying to live peacefully. Others feel a growing sense of fatigue: years of policy shifts, court rulings, and promises of reform that never fully materialize. They live in limbo, aware that every new political cycle brings new calculations about their worth, risk, and visibility. Still, within all this complexity lies the opportunity for more thoughtful dialogue. The challenge is not merely to ask, should ICE be doing this, but to also ask, what outcomes do we truly seek? Do we value order or inclusion, accountability or redemption? These are not binary choices, but tensions to be navigated. And navigating them requires listening not only to policymakers and experts, but to those living the consequences every day. It is also worth noting that amid these developments, legal pathways to regularization remain limited. The long-promised reforms paths to citizenship for DACA recipients, agricultural workers, or others continue to stall in Congress. Without legislative movement, executive enforcement becomes the bluntest available tool wielded in absence of policy clarity. And that in itself is a structural issue that deserves attention. So we return to the question we posed before: why is this happening? In many ways, it is a convergence of policy politics and inertia. It is happening because institutions follow rules written long ago, because agents act within broad discretion, because candidates campaign with tough language, and because for all our national conversation on immigration, the solutions remain partial and unresolved. But amidst these truths, there is still room for optimism. The very act of recognizing these complexities is a step towards something better. A more honest debate, a more balanced system, a more compassionate view of law and belonging. As we pause before continuing to explore future possibilities, we reflect once more. This is not simply about who is arrested or why. It is about what kind of country we are striving to be, and whether our actions gently reflect our stated ideals. Now, as night deepens and our reflections settle, we gently turn to imagination, not wild speculation, but grounded, thoughtful, what-if considerations. These quiet projections help us hold space for the uncertainties that surround any evolving policy. They let us peer into alternate outcomes, not as alarm, but as exercise in civic mindfulness. What if the trend of detaining non-criminal, undocumented individuals continues quietly reshaping the interior enforcement landscape? Over time, we might see a shift not only in statistics, but in the social fabric of immigrant communities. Families may grow more cautious, reducing interaction with public services. Schools might struggle with student absences. Local health departments could face lower engagement from immigrant populations even when services are critical. Yet what if instead this trend draws increasing attention and leads to legislative reform? Suppose Congress, under pressure from constituents and advocates, decides to revise federal enforcement priorities, embedding clearer guidelines and stronger judicial oversight. In that future, ICE operations could become more focused and transparent, offering more consistent outcomes across jurisdictions. Agents might gain clearer discretion, courts might see fewer contested removals, and communities could begin rebuilding trust. Or let us imagine a future where cities and states take greater control over immigration enforcement decisions, asserting their local values while navigating federal laws. Some jurisdictions may double down on sanctuary policies, creating visible contrasts with others that pursue strict compliance. This patchwork could lead to new legal challenges, but also innovation in how localities protect public safety while preserving community cohesion. We might also consider a human-centered shift. What if policy begins to reflect not just status, but contribution, instead of a simple legal check? ICE decisions could involve broader assessments. Has this person worked here for many years? Do they care for a family? Do they serve in their community? These softer measures already used in some immigration courts could become mainstream. The result: fewer abrupt separations, more dignity in decision-making. And finally, what if we take the long view? Imagine an America where immigration enforcement is no longer a flashpoint of political division, but a shared responsibility managed with nuanced care and predictability. This does not mean erasing law or borders, but respecting both the letter and the spirit of policy. Enforcement continues, but with clarity, fairness, and grace. These imagined futures are not distant dreams. They are potential pathways shaped by how we act today. As we look gently at what might be, we are reminded that policy is not destiny, it is direction, and directions can change. The story we tell ourselves about enforcement is in the end a story about identity, of who belongs, who decides, and how we treat those in between. By holding space for possibility, we offer ourselves and others a little more room to breathe. And now, as the night draws to its quietest hours, we reach the close of our shared reflection. What began as a report about ICE arrests has gently unfolded into something more enduring, a meditation on how power moves through policy and how people respond with strength, dignity, and quiet resilience. This moment in immigration enforcement, marked by growing numbers of non-criminal arrests, reminds us of a deep truth. Systems are made by people, and they can be remade by them too. Change often begins in small, careful acknowledgements, in asking why actions unfold the way they do, in listening to stories that challenge assumptions, and in looking at what we choose to do, not only when we agree, but when we are unsure. We've explored the reality behind campaign messaging, considered who is affected, and imagined gentler futures. We've listened for the truth between numbers and narrative. And along the way, we've taken care not to rush. In a time so often filled with noise, this slow rhythm has a value of its own. There is in all of this a quiet current of hope. Not a naive belief that everything will resolve itself, but a thoughtful optimism rooted in the belief that awareness can lead to action and action to improvement. Policies can evolve, communities can adapt, and even institutions long guided by force can move toward fairness when urged by people willing to reflect, to speak up, and to care. Tomorrow will bring new headlines, new speeches, new shifts in enforcement and legal review. But what you carry forward tonight is not the burden of uncertainty, it is the gift of understanding. That alone brings a little more peace into the world. So tonight, as you close your eyes and let your thoughts quiet, know this: the arc of policy is long and complex, but its movement depends not only on leaders, but on listeners like you. On those who ask calmly, think clearly, and dream carefully. Thank you for spending this time in thoughtfulness and care. Sleep well, and may your rest be full of peace and clarity.